Increasingly, people are becoming, I think, familiar with Marx. I mean, Marx gets revived periodically whenever there's an economic crisis, whenever capitalism goes into one of its periodic spasms, Marx is revived, and people immediately and obviously turn towards Das Kapital as a way of understanding the world that they see around them. And that's right and obvious. But I think what gets forgotten is the richness of Marx's entire body of theory and his thought, and Engels as well, and also that. And I think I wanted to run this because I firmly believe that Marx's thought, you can't understand the critique of capitalism without understanding historical materialism. In fact, historical materialism is the name for the entire body of his social thought, of which the criticism of capitalism is one aspect, and yet that's the aspect that people come to most readily because that's the most obvious thing that drives people back to Marx, I suppose. So these, as Will said, there's 3 lectures. The way I want to do this is that in the first lecture we talk about, I suppose, historical materialism at its highest level of abstraction, and that's the centrality of labour and production in Marx's thought. And although Will's been very kind and said that I'd explain things clearly, I'm conscious that I may not. So hopefully I will leave enough time for a discussion where we can explain some of the things a bit more if they're not clear. The second lecture will look at the position of class struggle within historical materialism in more detail. So moving away down from the more abstract discussion of macro history into the position of class struggle within epochs of social revolution, as Marx puts it. And then the third one is going to be a little bit more of me, I suppose, speculating a little bit about why I think it's important, what I think historical materialism does to change I've whimsically titled it "Historical Materialism Will Change Your Life," and that might be an extreme claim, but I do think it does change the way that we think of ourselves as agents in history, and it should change the way that we think of ourselves as socialists or revolutionaries or whatever. Historical materialism does involve a change in perspective, I think. So I'll kick off with tonight's one by looking at, I suppose, reiterating the point I just made. History is at the centre of Marx's thought. Marx's case for socialism, for example, is not based on a criticism of capitalism because socialism is morally superior, and it's not based on it because it's more rational. It's not a more rational system necessarily. These are all transhistorical judgments which are applied to a society, and Marx had no time for that. Marx's case for the possibility of a socialist future rests instead on his understanding of the movement of history, that historical development itself was creating the possibility of socialism out of capitalism. And as a result of that perspective, Marx sees history as a unified and coherent whole, connected by an unfolding human drama. And that's a drama in which the struggle for socialism represents the latest, but by no means the last stage of human history. Now, this is very different, I think, from the kind of popular understandings of history that surround us. I suppose I kind of think of it like there's a view that history is like a fridge that can be raided periodically for whatever examples people want to draw from it according to whatever they're interested in. And I think that this is something that applies to the left as well as everybody else, that we look for. There is a tendency to look at history as a kind of a larder full of examples of oppression or rebellion or whatever. And I don't think that certainly isn't what historical materialism is. Historical materialism gives you a way of understanding history as a complex of processes, of unified complex of processes that we need to understand, and that gives us a way of acting in the present. Marx argues that humans make their own history, but not just as they please. On one level, that's a really commonplace observation. But actually, I think once we look at historical materialism, you see that it's a very rich way of thinking about about human agency in history. Marx believed we can consciously shape our own history, but only if we understand it, only if we understand the limits and the conditions into which we're thrown by history. And it's not enough to be mobilised by inspiring stories from our past. We've got to analyse and understand that position in history in order to take meaningful action in the present. So that means that each generation, each section of the working class faces a specific set of historical challenges, not just limits to their freedom, but forces that present us with opportunities. Our ability to understand these forces and limits underpins our ability to effect conscious change in the present. So Marx and Engels develop far more than a critique of capitalism. They develop a whole set of tools for understanding the movement of history, and that's what these lectures are going to look at. So historical thinking often starts from, has often started from a kind of a set of first principles about human nature. In fact, not just historical thinking, but social thought more generally. First principles about human nature, that history is about the work of God's will, or that human nature is rational, or in the process of becoming more rational, or that it's selfish and programmed to be maximising, or that we're fundamentally moral beings. Well, Marx would argue that human nature doesn't have any fixed transhistorical character. All those ideas about human nature are themselves historical products. And in fact, for Marx, all concepts are historical products, which doesn't make them untrue, but they are historical products. And that's something we could talk a bit more about later on if we wanted to. But human nature is a historically articulated thing. But he and Engels did believe that there was something specific that identified humans as a unique species, and that we can see that unique quality if we look at the arc of human history itself. And that's the quote that I've put up there from the German ideology. If we study humans in their history, we can see something much more dynamic. For example, human society has developed from tiny groups of Paleolithic hominids to vast and complex civilizations, wielding astonishing and terrifying productive and destructive power. What is it that lies at the root of that history? What is it that propels humans through a history that's unique among species on this planet? And it's Marx and Engels argue it's the capacity to produce. So for Marx and Engels, humans are both part of the natural animal world and qualitatively different from other species. They're different in that uniquely they've developed the capacity to consciously produce tools and other means to fulfill basic needs, which, as Marx and Engels explain in the German ideology, form the basis of new needs, which in turn generate the development of more conscious production, more sophisticated tools and skills and new productive powers. From the quote from the German ideology here, life involves before everything else eating and drinking, habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy those needs, the production of material life itself. The satisfaction of the first need, the act of satisfying, and the instrument of satisfaction that's been acquired leads to new needs, and this production of new needs is the first historical act. It's that propels humans into what we call history. And in Dialectics of Nature, Engels projected Marx's sort of philosophical insight, I suppose, into the understanding at the time he was writing of the development of human biology as well, and human natural historical development, brilliantly showing how the capacity to create tools created not just new needs, but enabled the further development of complex human organisms, stimulating manual dexterity, development of the brain and the evolution of the senses, social organization and language, and the early development of the division of labor. Labor and human development act and react upon one another in a constant dynamic. And I think what's really remarkable about that understanding of human development is that much subsequent archaeological research into the fossil record of early hominid development bears that theory out. Basic tool use doesn't follow with the emergence of a recognizable Homo sapiens, for example, but moves in lockstep with over millions of years with the development of various types of hominids who started to walk on two legs. Tool use and the development of the human brain and hand developed together, just as Engels wrote more speculatively in Dialectics of Nature. And subsequent research into animal tool use largely bears out the idea that even among the most sophisticated primates, there is a qualitative difference from humans in that they don't make tools for making tools, for example. Anyway, so humans uniquely make their own history, but they don't make it just as they please. Humans transform and change themselves and their world, but they do so in the context of limits and necessities. And I've put up what those limits are. Humans must produce to live as organic beings. That's a necessity. We can't will that away. They must produce to be human beyond mere survival. It's the thing that distinguishes them as a species. And they must produce in the context of social relationships that exist independently of our will. We can't will them away. These are not just limits, however. Marx and Engels envisage them as being the conditions of conscious and therefore free productive activity. So again, it's not just enough to be emotionally or psychologically mobilized by inspiring stories from the past. We've got to understand and analyze the position of humans in history in order to take meaningful action in the present. Each generation is born into social relations that are the result of the actions and interactions of these necessities and these freedoms and powers among previous generations. And those social relations inherited from the past are the conditions that form the thinking of historical agents in the present. And the degree to which humans are conscious of that inheritance and those conditions, it determines the degree to which they can take self-conscious action and control both external nature and their own nature. Now, that discussion takes place at a fairly, as I said, at a relatively philosophical level, a high level of abstraction about humanity as a whole. But Marx and Engels develop a set of concepts for analysing the way in which those relationships are played out at a social level through the history of entire human societies by creating the concepts of the forces and relations of production. And what the forces and relations of production allow you to do is they allow you to examine entire human societies in time. You can, within each human society, you can see social change at work by breaking them up, by looking at what's happening within production. And to do that, they break up production into these two elements, the forces and relations of production. The forces of production are the technologies, the skills, the ideas through which production takes place. And the relations of production in any society are the social property relations, the structures, the practices and institutions that give shape to society and through which the forces of production are expressed. So, for example, in feudal England, mere 600 years ago, the forces of production were animal-powered ploughs, water and windmills for the milling of grain, and the skills required to produce and manage livestock, flocks and herds on a relatively small scale, together with handicraft productions in manufactures. And the relations were variously sized, but mostly small farms, directly farmed by peasants, but owing dues in the form of labour services, dues in kind or rent to a class of landlords. By contrast, if we look at today's capitalist society, the forces of production would include the vast build-up of machinery and ICT technology, deployed in industry, agriculture and trade, the body of available scientific knowledge, the skills, the education of workers, their organisation in large cooperative, even often transnational combinations of production and so on. And the relations of production would be those of private property, private property in the means of production, the exploitation of workers through the wage relationship, and overlaid with a tendency towards the formation of large monopolies and financial forms of ownership and some forms of state ownership. Now, that gives you a sort of way of analysing the structure of any given society by looking at what's happening in production. But this is a dynamic set of concepts. This is Marx and Engels examine the way in which the forces and relations of production move into contradiction with each other, and this becomes a motivating force within history. And they do this by arguing that the forces of production tend to spontaneously develop for all the reasons we've been talking about, that I was talking about a little while back. That there is a spontaneous tendency within the forces of relation to forces of production to spontaneously develop, because humans are restless and innovative, productive beings. And the relations of production are relatively conservative. These are the social institutions that are thrown up by productive forces at a given point in time, and people inhabit and reproduce those relationships and those property structures over time. But they don't constantly innovate within those. You don't constantly look to change social organisations and property structures, not least because there's generally a class of people benefiting from their existence. But as they say, as Marx puts it in the famous preface to his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which contains the most condensed statement of this part of historical materialism, at a certain stage of development, the productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or to say it the same in a different way, in legal terms rather, with the property relations within the framework of which they've operated hitherto. Now, from forms of production, forms of development of the productive forces, relations then turn into their fetters, and then begins an era of social revolution. So over time, forces of production and new relations that are thrown up around them begin to experience the dominant forces and relations as fetters on their further development, or the reproduction of their new relations. So from once having been forms of development, things become fetters. And Marx gives a fantastic example of this in Das Kapital, arguing that this is exactly what is happening within capitalism today, that actually capitalism unleashes vast new productive powers, productive forces, abolishing the constraints of a feudal mode which ties people to the land and to personal relationships, and enshrining private property in the means of production, whilst simultaneously dispossessing the vast majority of the peasantry, turning them into wage labourers and proletarians. And in that way, capitalism is able to unlock vast new productive powers. And capitalist relations of production become entrenched, private property in the means of production, and the wage relationship, and this drives, once those relations become entrenched, capitalists then have to compete with one another to survive, and this compels them to seek new ways of extracting surplus labour, surplus value from their workers through class struggle, through the imposition of factory production, and subjecting workers to the control of machinery. In this way, capitalism revolutionises production. But just even as that's happening, Marx argues, once the economic laws of capitalism are unleashed, this also creates forces of production that begin to experience capitalism as a fetter on their further development. Workers who are thrown together in great big combinations of cooperative labour, or social labour as Marx calls it, are becoming engaged in a higher form of productive activity. They are innovating and learning how to administer and to practically operate social production on a huge scale that could potentially be done without capitalists. And at the same time, capitalism's exploitation of workers is creating the imperative on workers to combine and defensively in defence of their wages, and to experience capitalists as a fetter upon their own development. Capitalism's laws of accumulation themselves are helping to bring this goal into sight. The constant war of all against all creates bigger and bigger units of capital at the expense of the smaller ones, reducing the numbers of the capitalist class to the point where vast organisations of production could, in theory, simply be expropriated by the proletariat, and capitalists themselves could be expropriated. So exploitation drives workers to resist capitalists, and potentially identify private property in the means of production as a fetter on their free and associated development as producers. So the key contradiction driving human history, I've dwelt on capital there because I wanted to show how that historical materialism is worked through something which is not a historical work. It's a highly structural account of how capitalism's laws operate, and yet actually this theory about the relationship between forces and relations of production is absolutely at the heart of even that. The key contradiction driving human history, Marx says, is that between the restless transformative power of human productive activity and its products, the social relationships through which that activity is articulated. At certain points in human history, these developments burst through and disrupt social relationships that have changed the character, stopping being things that express and give form to production and starting to become fetters to their further development. And this dynamic makes human history a series of great epochal revolutions. They're not simply political revolutions, although these are part of the process, but huge social, economic and intellectual transformations that take place over centuries. Now, these epochs of social revolution produce qualitative changes in the forces and relations of production, and Marx develops the concept of a mode of production for grasping that. The mode of production, because we have to look at production to understand human history, the key to understanding any social change is to look at the mode of production within it, which both structures and transforms any society. Each historical society or social formation, as he calls it, will have its dominant mode of production. And these are combinations of particular combinations of historical forces and relations of production: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The feudal, capitalist and socialist societies are defined not by the relationships of exchange between them or by any theory of social justice or anything like that. They're defined by the mode of production which takes place within them. And this is really important for Marx's revolutionary thought, because it's essential to revolutionary strategy, and we can see that from the critique of the Gotha program. Right? The critique of the Gotha program, which was Marx's marginal notes on the program of German Social Democrats in 1875, in which he took issue with the German Social Democrats for their concept of having workers having the rewards for their labour, the full value of their labour returned to them. And Marx said, no, that's completely to misunderstand the point of socialism. That the thing that will tell you when you have moved from a capitalist to a socialist society is when you've uprooted private property in the means of production. Only then can you make the transition from one society to the other, and that has to be at the centre of any revolutionary party's activity. So it isn't just a logical point about how you analyse societies. It's a guide to revolutionary strategy. And this is also important because it reminds us about the importance of class struggle in Marx and Engels' vision. Because of the emphasis that I'm putting on production and the relatively high level at which this discussion is taking place, as opposed to the way in which Marx used historical materialism to comment on particular historical events or revolutionary processes, because I'm pitching it at this level and looking at his entire vision of human history, I suppose, the position of class struggle sort of recedes slightly in this, but I want to kind of ensure that it's in here because it's important as part of that to grasp that class struggle plays a key role within these epochal social changes that take place over centuries for Marx in the transition from one mode of production to another. And we will look at this in much more detail in next week's lecture, exactly how Marx sees class struggle as being absolutely at the key of revolutionary social change. In the preface, right, the famous preface, which, as I've said, is the most condensed expression of his vision of social change, Marx says no social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it's sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions of their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. Now, I mean, that was for a school of of Marxists at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. That was that provided some kind of rationale for foreseeing the transition towards socialism as more or less inevitable, and something which you just had to wait for, and at the right time, socialism would sort of spring out of the womb of the old society with relatively minimal intervention from socialist parties, and that was the battle that Lenin fought within the Marxist movement to argue that that was a completely false understanding of the role of the revolutionary party within society. But we'll come back to that in the third lecture, I suppose. The point that I want to make here is that in another part, which is in another part of Marx's historical materialist writing, he makes a really interesting observation that a revolutionary class is itself a productive force. Right? That the coming into, and this is the quote from The Poverty of Philosophy, which I put in there, of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself. And the organisation of a revolutionary elements as a class supposes the existence of all the productive forces that could be engendered in the bosom of the old society. And I think what Marx means by that is that once a mode of production has started to disintegrate and a new one has started to emerge within it, to a certain degree, to the degree that a revolutionary class, a class that can't actually continue existing within the old system without cohering, coalescing and beginning to struggle. Once that happens, then historically speaking, that mode of production is exhausted. That is the point at which you say that mode of production is no longer adequate for developing the productive forces. So and he argues this, I think, in the German ideology. He talks and the Communist Manifesto. He talks a lot about the process by which the bourgeoisie, over centuries, grew up with and its relations of production, of exchange and mercantile trade and commerce and the employment of wage labour grew up within the feudal mode of production to a point where they started to experience the political dominance of landlords as a fetter and an obstacle to them, and they were thrown together. It was a process that took centuries, but they were thrown together and coalesced into a class, so that by the 18th and 19th centuries they had identified the need to take control of the state from the feudal class as being a necessary objective. At that point when a class has come into being and is struggling to take control of the state within the old society, then you say that society is exhausted, that society is no longer adequate for developing the productive forces. And Marx argues the same thing about with the working class. The working class, the moment the working class, in The Poverty of Philosophy, talks about how spontaneous class struggle is growing up within industry. The class is being forced together. Permanent trade unions are coming into existence. Sooner or later, they're going to be forced together into a movement, and then they will need a political party. And at that point, then you can say this is a class that's self-consciously struggling, and it's become in itself a productive force. So far from being an argument for sort of political quietism, understanding the fact that a class that experiences society as being a fetter on its development anymore, that is in itself a productive force. And I want to finish up by talking about by coming back to capitalism again, because I think what this understanding of history at its biggest scale tells us is not that, is a really important point about the status of capitalism. It's not just a disaster that's happened to people. It's the culmination of a historical process, and Marx's argument is that it has played a progressive role, which is not to say that we look back on in the history of capitalism with any fondness or delight for the things that it has done, but it is to say that when you view it's progressive, but the progressive role of capitalism can only become apparent when it has been surpassed, when it's been transcended and overthrown. It is progressive in as much as it's creating the potential for its own overthrow, in unleashing the power of social labour, of cooperation and the technological basis and the relations of production basis for within a working class for the construction of a socialist society. Through the abolition of a capitalist class, at that point, capitalism has definitely played a progressive role in history, and it is really I think it's, you know, I have a quibble about the slogan "Another world is possible." Right? People who've been to my talks before will have heard me say this, so I apologise for that. But the quibble with "Another world is possible" is that it's a voluntarist. It's a kind of anything is possible. Anything different is better than this slogan, and it's Marx and Engels' vision is much more powerful. It's that another world is coming into being. We just have to recognise it and ensure that our activity is geared towards unleashing it and unlocking it, the potential that's being developed within the capitalist system for a higher social order.